Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi. In our last episode, we spoke with Michael Paliotti about his academic background and what ultimately led him to transition out of the lab. He shared his early experiences in research, his decision to move into industry, and what motivated him to take that leap. If you missed it, be sure to listen to part 1. In part 2, Michael takes us through the beginning of his commercial career, how he adjusted to working with customers, the differences between academia and industry, and the mindset shift required to succeed in sales. We'll also discuss how he approached building trust with scientists, the importance of long-term relationship building, and how he found his footing in a new role.
Tell me a little bit more about, what was it about industry that interested you? And then tell me a little bit about Cellomics.
Yeah, I think I was always kind of more business side, business oriented. I mean, that was kind of always a side interest of mine, so, stock market and all that other stuff, even when I didn't have any money to invest, but just understanding all that. So I think, being in that whole atmosphere is something I wanted to combine, right? The science and also the business. And I like the idea of actually, producing products too, right? So you can actually see at the end, what your work actually went to. Not to say that doesn't happen in academia, but it's more, just basic science. You're trying to answer questions. You're not necessarily going towards a specific goal as far as a product. So when I came over to Cellomics, they were one of the pioneers at the time for high content screening, which was basically, looking at individual cells and looking within those individual cells of how you might see different metabolites or whatever moving. And so it was kind of a novel thing at the time, and they were really the forerunners on it. They obviously didn't market it very well because they didn't end up being the forerunners. In fact, I think they ended up getting purchased by Thermo, but it was interesting too. So it was like, wow, here's some innovation, right? But also we're working towards, a final product. And so I was there working on some of the kits for that machine, which was called the ArrayScan 2 at the time. And we were working on, NF-kappa B movement within the cell, NF-kappa B moving in the nucleus, that type of thing, and, trying to see, what we were treating the cells with, what would signify certain pathways or whatnot. But the interesting thing, though, is the lab that I was in, which was with a former postdoc, she had a DARPA grant, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, if nobody knows what that is. And we actually were working on biosensors for a variety of different toxins. One of those being botulism, and another one being, what was the other one? It'll come to me. But it was kind of cool. So we were working on all these different types of really cool stuff. The idea is that, they could have these array scans or mini versions on the back of a Humvee out in the field, right? And they could do some of these analyses and say, okay, is this airborne toxin here, right? That type of stuff. So that was really kind of cool work too, which segues me into kind of another thing too, is it was very interesting. It was at that time that 9/11 happened. And so I think everybody in, my generation remembers, when 9/11 happened. My parents is when Kennedy got shot. For us, it was 9/11. And so I remember exactly where I was and, looking at the screen, and my buddy comes over to me. He's like, oh, there's a plane that just crashed into the World Trade Center. I'm like, yeah, we thought it was a Cessna or something. Like, oh, this kind of sucks, but whatever. And of course, it obviously manifested into what it was. But going back to the DARPA thing, after, things settled down, we ended up getting a visit from the FBI because we were working on these toxins. Because if you remember, shortly after 9/11, they had a scare of, oh crap, what was the toxin they were using? They put in the envelopes. Anthrax, yes, anthrax. And we were working in anthrax. Sorry, just too much going on. So we were working on that. And so they had that scare. And so they came to talk with us. Well, I guess make sure that we were on the up and up, number one, and number two, just to get some information. So I'm like, that was kind of funky. And we were in an small little incubator at the time, so we didn't actually even have our own buildings so for them to come out, like it was outside Pittsburgh, built in the 50s, these,
were there like FBI jackets? Like,
yeah, it was crazy. They weren't there very long, but I'm like, this is kind of weird. I'm like, okay. So I'm like, yeah, no, it wasn't me.
I promise was not me. Yeah.
Because, I think, they were, looking at all these different labs that had funding or that had gotten significant amounts of, anthrax or these other toxins. I mean, we got it legally, of course. I'm just making sure, hey, maybe we know something, maybe we don't know something, maybe we can, whatever. So that was kind of an interesting aspect of that.
That's crazy. Well. Yeah, that's crazy. And I'm thinking about exactly what you said about like the opportunity to create a product. And you mentioned that eventually, they got acquired. But I think, and you're talking about like the product can be revolutionary, but just again, just like communicating the product to the end users and getting the word out is so critically important.
Yep.
Which I think, and that's why I always think about that from the perspective of like Apple and like Steve Jobs, like effective communicator. Like,
well, they created a market. I mean, they didn't create a phone that did stuff, right? They created a small computer that actually also happened to be a phone, right? And so that, that's the tough part of it all. I mean, and in my wine business, it's the same thing. I mean, our wine is really good, and in the wine industry too, the saying is, hey, making wine is not difficult. Selling wine is the problem. And that's the truth. And so, it's getting that word out there. How do you differentiate yourself? And how do you create that market that people want to wait in line, before the iPhones are even released, for days just because they need it, right? How do you, that's the tough part. Those are the true visionaries that can do that.
Yeah. And something too, as something as I've learned as like I've come continuously working on it, and just like as a company, we're always working on it too, is like, and for anyone who's out there who's like embarking on, who may be running or contemplating starting a company that makes products and that will eventually have to sell products, is that selling features will only get you so far. You have a lot of buying decisions are not incredibly rational. Like there's a lot of qualitative, like emotional aspects too, that kind of go into a purchasing decision. And this is not to say that you can have bad features. Like it is, again, necessary to have a good product. But again, it's insufficient if you're going to go sell the thing.
And even then, many times, and this goes when I got my MBA too, is like, some of these companies you learn about, they can actually create the imagery of a product that people just desire, when maybe even the product is not even the best. And one good example of that, and I don't want anybody to be bad at me, but is Harley Davidson, right? Harley Davidson, they have a cult following, and it's awesome. But at the end of the day, from what I understand, riding a Harley Davidson is not the most, it's not the best, smoothest ride.
Easiest.
Right?
It's not the easiest ride.
Yeah, I mean, there are better bikes out there as far as smooth ride, probably miles per gallon or whatnot, but that doesn't matter, right? It's the name and the image behind it, and how they were able to create that whole ecosystem, and it's really amazing.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, again, just like this breadth of like learnings, it also can apply. You can bring those kind of concepts to science too. Mm-hmm. Like you can't, and not to say that you should be peddling inferior product. Like that's not.
Oh yeah, no.
It's right. Like when magic happens is if you have an excellent product and you can effectively communicate it and appeal to not just the quantitative aspects of your product. It's like, and also like, especially for anyone who's out there doing, trying to figure out how to crack larger organizations and enterprises, that becomes like a whole nother thing where there's like 12 stakeholders and they all care about different things. And some of them are not rational. But some of them are not rational. Probably the end user who's actually hands on the thing, probably like this is going to like materially change my workflow. It will save me hours. But then there's like 10 other people who actually don't really care that you're saving 10 hours, but they care about other things. And how do you communicate that and communicate that? And anyways, I'm getting,
No,
ahead of
it
myself.
blows my mind to some of the products, how they actually are released, for just your regular consumer stuff. And you're like, this is just stupid. I mean, and this is kind of off the subject, but I mean, same type of thing. I just picked up my new company car yesterday or the day before. And it's a Toyota RAV4. I'm like, all right, it's cool. I had a Subaru before. Anyway, long story short, just driving my wife last night. I'm like, this is stupid. The volume to control the radios on this side, but to be able to control the change of the channels over here, where in the Subaru was both on the same side. I said, I drive like this. So I'm like changing the volume. Now I got to go change this. I mean, it's like, why didn't they think of it? Just put these stupid buttons over here. I don't even know what they do. Right? Did they ask anybody? Right?
Exactly. And sometimes that just happens. Like, it's like when there's like multiple, like when there's like many stakeholders, things get lost in the mix, and they're not. And sometimes the decisions that are made are just not rational, and they don't make sense.
I was like, did you ask the person who drive the car? We don't all drive like this. My wife
exactly. Exactly. And so, it sounds like Cellomics was like, well, I guess maybe just questions. It was a startup. Like, how was it like, it sounds like you had a lot of like tactical experience, but what was it just like working at a startup or when you were previously in an academic kind of environment?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was very interesting. I mean, it was exciting because you could wear a variety of different hats, right? And so we were working on the DARPA project. We were working on, other projects. I remember we had something that was coming, the kinetic scan coming out, which was doing, more kinetics as opposed to just steady state looking at high content screening. So, I got to work on that a little bit and be on a variety of different teams. But, there's also like, hey, we have to get the product out, or we are, we have limited amount of time. And I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, and this is one of the reasons why I ended up leaving is, we had some layoffs, right? And like, well, we didn't meet these, particular deadlines, or, we've been working on this, and you know what? It doesn't work, or, it doesn't work to what we want, right? So, I mean, it's exciting because, I mean, the world's your oyster with respect to like, okay, we can do this. Like, we're trying to basically create something nobody else has done before. And if we do, it could be great. And meanwhile, I'm learning a whole bunch of different things, but, if it doesn't, well, it so be it. And so that's really what happened. I remember we had one set of layoffs, and there was two research sales associates. That's my term, people. Two research associates in the lab. Myself and an older gentleman who I got to know really well. His name was Rich Cumby. And I remember when they had the first set of layoffs, and he was there before me, and I'm like, oh crap. And they ended up laying off him. And then to this day, I'm like, I can figure it out, but I'm like, I don't understand why, they laid off him as opposed to me. He had been there longer, and I think it was just kind of like, I was more of a, go-getter, up and coming, just wide open to type things, and he was more, set in his ways, and not that it was horrible. And I really loved him. He used to, you have to remember, we're in Pittsburgh, so the climate is a little bit different from out here in California. So he used to go out for smoke breaks, like all the time and outside. And I used to joke with him and said, hey, Rich, I said, I actually calculated. So as many times as you go out for smoke breaks, I can quit December 18th. And then I have the rest of it, because that's about the amount of time that you've been out.
Yeah.
So they let him go. And then we actually ended up moving to a new building, surprisingly enough, which was in the works prior to that. And then I remember we actually were in the third floor, and there was nobody else up there. So I was up there kind of just doing work, but also moving some stuff and whatnot. And I remember Sarah came up to me, and my boss, who was the postdoc back in University of Pittsburgh, said, hey, we're having another set of layoffs. They've already let people go. And I'm on the third floor. I'm like, I don't know what the hell's going on. Yeah. Meanwhile, everybody's crying downstairs. I'm upstairs by bed. And I'm like, everything's kind of, I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't know that. Thanks for telling me. And so, we kind of went through these iterations, and I could kind of see the writing on the wall. I'm like, all right, and obviously I'm doing these experiments and seeing where the product is going, or where it might not be going, or that type of thing. And so I'm like, all right, maybe this is the time that I need to kind of step back and, maybe pull out, start looking for other alternatives. And so that's when that's when we ended up moving out to California, which is an interesting story too. So my wife was getting her master's in education. So she's a elementary school principal out here in Vista, California now, but she was a teacher prior to that. And so when I was looking for jobs, I'm like, oh my God, we're in Pittsburgh. There's not a heck of a lot here. I mean, Cellomics was really the only game in town as far as that's concerned. What do we want to do? And so we weren't really sure. And we were spending another vacation out in Phoenix, and we're sitting by the pool and like, man, like, what are we doing in Pittsburgh? I mean, that's the most temperate climate we've ever been in, because she went to Notre Dame too. She was from New Hampshire, so it was even worse than Rochester, New York, right? And we're like, all right, this is our chance to maybe just see what's out there. We don't have kids right at the moment. We don't have really a lot of stakeholders here. I mean, we don't know family close by. I mean, in Pittsburgh. So let's try it. And so this is another one of those inflection points in my life where if you had asked me what I was thinking, I'm like, I don't know. But we basically just said, we're moving to either San Diego because the biotech there, or Houston was another one. At the time, there's a few biotechs there, and then or Research Triangle Park. That's what we wanted to do. And we're like, okay, San Diego sounds like probably the best part. Let's see what we can do there. And so within like 4 weeks, she actually had a job interview at the same district here in Vista. It was at a charter school at the time, but it still was in Vista Unified, of which she is still a part of to this day.
Wow.
And she got the job out here, right away. And I'm like, oh my God. And I didn't even have a position. So I was talking with a couple people, and I literally got my job. I'll never forget, with a job offer in Visalia, Illinois, on the way out there. I was driving the big 26-foot Ryder truck. I remember talking to them, negotiating my salary in, Illinois. And so, I really didn't even have a position till I was halfway out here, which was kind of crazy, because I'm like, oh, you're just picking up everything and just leaving and going to California. Felt like we're on the Oregon Trail, and
Yeah.
So my dad, not luckily, but coincidentally, had just retired at that time. So I had a Volkswagen Jetta. He drove my Jetta. I drove the 26-foot truck, and my wife had a new Beetle, and we had 2 dogs, and the dogs were both in the back seat, anesthetized. They're one dog would never want to lay down, even though they had enough Benadryl on them to like knock them out. That one dog was always trying to always standing up. Anyway, so it took us, I think 5 days to get out here, a couple hundred, a couple 8-hour days to get out here. And, that was that's the way it is. And we ended up, finding an apartment and shortly bought a house not too long thereafter, maybe a year or so in Vista. And we've been here ever since. But the position that I got was with Genoptics. And once again, that's, it had to do with not only, what I was, good at, but who I knew. And so there was the chief scientific officer at the company at the time was TC Chung, and he happened to know a couple people at Cellomics because they went to SBS conferences together. I remember Joe Zock was one of the guys, so when I went out and I started chatting with them at the interviews, I was name dropping, but not necessarily on purpose, right? Because I didn't actually know he knew some of those people. And, it just kind of worked out really well. And I'm like, oh, wow, you'd be a good fit, And I think about it now. I mean, I was a research associate. I mean, this would never happen today. I mean, they flew me from Pittsburgh out to California for interviews, and then flew me back. I mean, you would never do that for a research sales associate nowadays. I mean, no way, So I think of how lucky I was that, they really wanted me. And, during that time that was somewhat, not uncommon. I mean, not necessarily normal, but, it was feasible. I mean, nowadays, you just find somebody locally. I mean, there's enough out here, right? So I got that position, and that was really interesting too, because that company, Genoptics, was founded by Tina Nova, who was one of the original scientific founders, if you will. I think it was with Ligand, originally kind of starting the biotech ecosystem that is down here in San Diego. So I got to know her really well. And, if you look up her name, she's been all over the place as far as biotech's concerned. She's, big name. So that was really kind of interesting too. And they had a really different technology. It was called optophoresis. And basically what they were doing is they were using light sources to move cells. So they're almost kind of like optical tweezers type thing. And we're trying to figure out, okay, how to optimize that, how it can be used for not only just manipulation of cells, but also it was in flow cytometry and how that, that can potentially work. So that was really interesting. I met some cool people there. my boss there, her name was Kathy Schnabel, really great person. And to this day, I'm so happy that I got to work for her. And she was really great in, on my growth. But I also learned from her that she was the first manager I had who was, really empathetic, really cared about, me as a person. Right. And also, not only the science, but our team. And so, we had to sometimes come in at like 3:00 in the morning, and she'd be like, "Oh, I don't want you to do this, maybe we'll switch or I'll come in, and I'm like, that was just novel to me. I'm like, wow, I really appreciate that. And so that really stuck with me, as far as, molding on some of, hey, this is how, if I was ever going to have people underneath me, how I'd want to be understanding, because I know where I'm coming from now. And it's, it's just not always the easiest thing.
Absolutely.
And because of her, that's how I ended up transitioning out of Genoptics to go to Novartis, because her husband worked at Novartis, and one of his good friends was a PI. Jing Lee was looking for a research associate. So Kathy told her husband to tell Jing to hire Michael, and that's how that worked too. So I mean, it's
whoa,
it's really a consistent story.
That's amazing. And I think I always like when people kind of like, I love hearing this, because it's like, and I love having the opportunities to have these kinds of conversations, because you can start seeing the through lines of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And I always like, and you're talking about the experience where it didn't pan out. And sometimes people are worried about taking opportunities that might not pan out, and because they're like, of course, it could be anxiety inducing. Like, you want some sort of like certainty. Everyone wants some sort of certainty. But I always think about it from the other side, where it's just like, irrespective of like, if the thing that they're working on is a worthwhile problem and you're working with it with people that you respect, that experience will ultimately be accretive. Like, you're going to learn dope things. You're also going to meet awesome people. And you just never know who these awesome people tend to know other awesome people. And exactly what you said, when you took that interview, you're like, I don't know that you know this person, but I just so happened to work with them. And I thought they were awesome. And they're like, oh, like, and that's the thing where it's just like, don't be shy. For anyone out there listening, it's like, don't be shy about, I am a shy person. So like, sometimes it took me a little bit of like getting out of my shell to kind of do it. And like you said, you don't need to like, just like name drop, but just like, put yourself out there, like, and good things tend to come. And something that also stood out to me is, in addition to one, putting yourself out there and just trying to surround yourself with awesome people, but it is never too late to take like, just like a business pivot. Like, you can do a personal pivot too. Like, your pivot from Pittsburgh to California. That's a big one. That's like, it's a big one. And a lasting one. It sounds like your wife has been in the unified school district for a long time. But like, it all starts with the willingness to make that pivot. Because I think sometimes you can kind of like get so zoned into the local maximum where you're just like, this is it for me.
Yeah.
And this is all I will ever know, that this is all that will ever be, in front, like, I can access. But really, I think, you can, it kind of reminds me of like when you go from high school to college, and like high school to college is a big one, because you don't have to be hung up with what you were like or did in high school. You can just like, you move across country and be you can explore and actually have self-discovery that's like, just like not that. And kind of like you're able to do it from, you're like, all right, well, Pittsburgh, like, doesn't seem like, this was the one shop in town. Like, let's do it and just move. And it opens up doors that you just never know. So I love hearing that. And it's funny because like, I'm just hearing it. I haven't left the Bay Area, so it's kind of so I'm like, I'm always fascinated by this moving across country, or these and same with people who are coming from international. I'm just like, dang, like that is like, it takes a lot of courage to do it.
Yeah. I know it's if you knew me prior to that, like I said, the straight laced, valedictorian, go to Notre Dame, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that just didn't fit my personality, but it's taking that leap of faith. And luckily my wife was there with me, and, we were, could do that together. Sometimes you just need to do it. And honestly, I think it's really helped shape the way I look at things now. And one of the things I'm kind of really known for at MilliporeSigma is trying to think outside the box, right? I'm like, I don't have to think within that local area. How can we do this differently? Well, we never, nobody ever thought of that, or that's just stupid. I'm like, well, try it, right? I mean, that's what when I told my people, friends in Pittsburgh, we're moving to California. I'm like, what? It's like, I'm like, oh, that's just kind of what we're doing. I'm like, all right, we'll come help you pack. Not that they wanted to get rid of us, but help us pack. Maybe some of them did. But, but yeah, so I mean, just knowing in your past that you've done some of these things, we sit back and after my wife and I have a glass of wine or something, just start chatting. So like, hey, man, imagine some of the things we did, those decisions, they completely reshaped our lives. Moving from Pennsylvania out here. I mean, it would obviously not be anywhere close to the same if we hadn't made that decision. Not to say that we wouldn't be successful in Pennsylvania, but I mean, the opportunities out here it's just different, right? Especially in the field that I'm in. And we just sit back and be like, God, what led us to those? And thank goodness we actually made those, but it's also, there are those inflection points that you come across in your life, and sometimes you make them. Sometimes there could be other inflection points that I did not make that, right? But I went this way, and I don't really know. But you actually walk the path that as best you can that you make, and you try to make those decisions when the fork comes in the road appropriately. Sometimes you may not. Like I said, you might not even know that you did it wrong, right? But when you choose that path, you're committed, and you just keep going until the next fork comes up and just say, okay, sometimes you roll the dice and sometimes you're like, oh, this one's obvious, right? So
yeah, it reminds me of you did a dice roll, or not? It was a kind of a calculated dice roll for optometry school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and sometimes it just isn't what you thought it was, and that's okay. And I think I always think about it as like, and I'm piggybacking on what like Bezos called it, as like the one-way door or the two-way door, like. If the decision that you're making is a two-way door where you can just like reverse it, like if you don't like what you see, dice roll it, like,
yeah.
But if it's like a one-way door where this is like, oh, if I go through this door, there's no going back. Take your time with that one, take that.
Right.
And don't get the paralysis when it is a two-way door. You're like, if I can just roll this back and just like control Z it, like,
right.
It'll be okay.
And be okay with it, and realize it's not a failure. It's just, just another try at something. I'd love, at my wife's school, they had the word, fail up on they do have it up there, but it stands for first attempt in learning, right? That's how they define the word fail. And it really is. I mean, it's like, hey, I'm going to try this out. It's my first attempt trying this. Didn't work, all right, it's not a failure as far as like I'm incompetent. It's just, it's not my cup of tea. And like I said, if you're in that revolving door, you just keep pushing it and
go right back.
Like, yeah,
you just go right back. And just like, that's okay. Like, all right, well,
sometimes you get stuck in the door for a while, but then eventually you get
exactly, eventually. And I think too, is just like, that's kind of like, at least in like, I found, especially in like when it comes to company building, that aspect is like critically important, because if you have the time, like you were talking about, like especially in your early startup experience, it's like you're measured by time. Like, what can you get done in a finite amount of time? And if you're not making those decisions as efficiently as you can, the candle just continues to burn down.
Yeah. And
so you need to like, and your judgment on these kinds of decision making gets better over time, but it's a muscle that you need to build. Like, you can't expect to be good at like figuring out quickly, is this a one way or a two way, unless you start doing it early, like, and just like get practice and reps on it. There are one way doors that I've missed. I thought were a two way door, and I was like, oops. Like, and you learn, and you take it with you the next time, and you just live with it, But I think that's a critically important, because if you're the better that you get at that, both personally on the business side, you don't get that paralysis. And you quickly can start to find like, what is it that you like? What are the work that you like to do? You start putting yourself in, better and better positions every single time.
Right. Yeah.
And it just gets better. So, you're now, I saw you mentioned that there's now the connection to Novartis. Like, what I guess, when did you know it was time to leave and head to Novartis? And then can tell us a little bit about that Novartis experience?
Yeah. So there was a similar thing with Genoptics as far as I think we were getting to the point of the technology. We're like, all right, I'm not sure how much farther this is going to go. And, you can kind of, see the way that it's going. And so it made sense at that time. And obviously Novartis is a big pharmaceutical company. And I'm like, all right, cool. This is kind of, and get in with the big boys. And so, so I moved over there and I really enjoyed it. I was there for a good 5 years. And, it was really interesting when I left Genoptics. I'll never forget. They're like, because one of the cool things about some of these startups is some of the benefits you get, right? So you can get stock options. And I'm like, of course, if you're leaving the company, you're like, well, obviously I'm leaving because I don't think they're going to be successful. Do you want these stock options? And they had gone, like, they originally were like, I don't know, like 10 cents. And shortly before I left, they like went up to $10 each. At the time, it was actually relatively a lot. Of course, I wasn't making a lot either. I'm like, I'm going to buy these stupid stock options for from $10 a piece. Well, fast forward, just you can see the line there. Not only did Genoptics, survive, they completely pivoted. So they went from a research company to a diagnostic company. Not only did they do that, but they moved from Carmel Valley, which I had to drive to every day, up here to Carlsbad, which is right around the corner for me. And then after all that, a couple years later, they got bought out by Novartis. It's kind of crazy after I left. But so it's kind of weird how that all comes around. Yeah. It's odd. I'm like, so I could have had stock options, driven less, and then still worked at the same company at the same time. But
the crystal ball, only if. And I think too, I love that story because, I think, again, just like moving across the country, and I always think about the courage that it took for Mark Zuckerberg to just rename the company Meta and also just like bet on the metaverse. That was major. Like, that was a major thing, almost like a bet the company kind of thing.
Yeah.
And obviously Meta is a very large company. And, but that being said, is that sometimes a pivot is what needs to happen. It can be like almost like hitting the e-brake and then hitting it like a 90-degree turn. And then it can turn into something like that. Right. And so, and I think too, because sometimes what happens in like, startup, the entrepreneurial journey is that you almost get too wedded to the thing that you're working on. You're like too close to it. You're like too close to it and maybe too precious about it. And it's almost if you're getting to the end of that with that proverbial candle, if it's too late, the e-brake is not going to, do anything because you're kind of at the end. But if you try your best to like figure out, do I want to stay on this path, like that fork in the road? Sometimes is what it takes. You have to turn into a diagnostics company.
Exactly.
And then maybe get bought by Novartis.
So crazy.
Right. And all that to be said is that it is possible. Like, it is possible. Not every pivot ends up working itself out. Sometimes just like you can sometimes you pivot too much. You're like, sometimes you pivot too much. But again, it's kind of like it's kind of like, again, you just work that muscle and you start building that intuition on like, okay, this is it. This is the right pivot. And like that is the one-way door almost. You're like, oh, we're now going to be a completely different thing. And I don't think we can go back to what Genoptics was before. So you were at your startup life. You're now at Novartis. Can you talk about that experience of joining a larger organization and how was that for you?
I really enjoyed it. I mean, it was much more structured. I mean, the ability to know that, they weren't going to be going out of business or at least I didn't think they were. I mean, they're still there. I'll go out of business anytime soon. There's some comfort in that. Of course, getting later in our lives. I mean, it's still young. I think I moved over there when I was like maybe 31. But, you start to think about, okay, we're going to, I have a family soon. And I was there for 5 years and for both my kids, say 2000. Yeah. So both my kids were born when I was there. So, that was kind of, somewhat of the thought process, but, I got to learn so much more and I got to get an idea of some of that cross-functional stuff, right? I get to see more of, hey, what's the marketing that they're doing or, and just a variety of different people. And of course, especially being in San Diego, everybody that worked there kind of came from somewhere, right? And so you have all these connections of, all these other people that have been doing stuff for a while. I mean, and at the time, the CEO of Novartis was Pete Schultz, who's huge down here in San Diego, and started up Caliber and was over at Scripps. And so, I mean, I got to meet him, got to be in his organization. I mean, not that we were best buddies or anything. I met him a couple times, but it's one of those things where you start, you're getting associated more and more with some of the people that are in the ecosystem. And it was when I was at Novartis too, that's when I decided to go back and get my my MBA at Cal State San Marcos up here.
Cool.
And it was one of those things, just like, all right, good. I've been doing this for a while now. Okay. I wanted to get into, the business aspect. Now I want to kind of get into more of the business aspect, maybe outside of the bench. And so in doing that, I did it in evenings and Saturdays. It took me like 3 years, wasn't too bad. But one of the things I mentioned that is because I remember I had to actually interview Pete Schultz at once as part of one of my classes. I'm like, that's cool. So, I got to really, chat with him and like, wow, this guy's pretty cool. I mean, he's kind of out on the podium all the time. Not really talk to him, but, so now he knew who I was, or at least can recognize me. And, I learned in taking those classes, I'm like, wow, I learned so much more of like why we do things here in a certain way, or why we can't do this, or, oh, this makes sense, and so I really enjoyed that whole experience. Unfortunately, at the time, I don't know why, but Novartis is the only company I ever worked at that never paid for schooling, but that's the only time I went back. So like, whatever.
Yeah. God damn, it's just the timing. Yeah.
Just the way it worked out. And it was weird. So I was at Novartis for 5 years, met some great people there, was on a bunch of projects. We were working on GPR 119 for diabetes, small molecule drug. And I was doing assay development, cell-based culture assay development to basically test all the candidates. And, I learned how, I would do this stuff and then would go back to med chem, and then they would modify it and come back down. I tested again, so I learned the whole, the concept of, the drug discovery pipeline, or at least, portions of it. So that was kind of neat. But then, like I said, I went back and got my MBA, and I don't know what it is. To this day, I don't know if when you get your MBA, they put you on a list or something, but almost immediately after I got my degree, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do with it. I mean, I figured, okay, I still wanted to, kind of meld the two together, the MBA and my master's in biology, master's and bachelor's in biology, but how to do that. And shortly thereafter, I graduated or got my degree. I got contacted by Millipore at the time, Corning, and I think it was GE at the time, which is now Cytiva, all for field application scientist job. I'm like, wow. And I didn't really know what that was, but when I learned more about it, I'm like, it was perfect, right? You're a scientist, but you're in the field helping customers, right? Kind of selling stuff, but not really directly, which is kind of like, all right, cool. That is the mix of what I'm looking for. And so that's how I transitioned into that. And of course, I picked Millipore because I'm still here, iterations down of different mergers that we've had nonetheless. But that was another one of those inflection points, that was, very key to me too. And I will never forget, they were looking for somebody that could do, Luminex assays, which I had never done before, stem cell experience, which I had never done before, and some molecular biology, which I had done, but wasn't really the same specifics that they were doing. So you have to remember, I'm going to go in, I'm supposed to be the expert on this. I'm like, oh crap, I'm like, I don't know all this, but this, and it's a similar theme. This goes really back to the same thing with the Pennsylvania State Police. I went to the interview, and it was the way that I held myself, the stories that I told, the mannerisms that I had, the personality, how I could relate to them, that I got hired. Because after the fact, they told me, they said, there were two people that we were interviewing that day. There was you and this other gentleman. On paper, that guy was perfect. He did everything that we needed him to do from a scientific standpoint. The Luminex assays, blah, blah, blah. But when we interviewed the two of you, it flip-flopped because he just didn't sell himself for what, we needed to have somebody in the field, or we couldn't see him on the team, right? Now, you might not have had all that experience, but we knew you could learn it based on all your, background. So, that's something I really want to stress to people listening out there too, is don't be discouraged if you want a job or something and you don't think you meet those criteria on the job rec, right? Try it anyway. I mean, it happened for me twice. I would never guessed in a million years I would have got hired at the Pennsylvania State Police. And in retrospect, I was surprised at this too, but it actually worked out. And so then I started, with Millipore, and I was a field application scientist, and I love the position and did that for, I think ended up being like a year and a half. And sure, I supported all of Southern California, LA, down here in San Diego, and I think Colorado, Arizona, Wyoming, whatnot. The account managers or the sales reps in those different areas as a specialist for those particular products. So it's kind of cool. So then all of a sudden I got to travel a little bit more. I'm like, oh, I'd never been to Denver before. I'd never been to Laramie, Wyoming before, which we haven't been back. I've never been to Salt Lake City before. I had to do training, and I ended up going to Houston. So like, wow, this is cool. I'd never been to these places. So it started opening up some doors that I really enjoyed too. And it was nice being part of another larger company. Millipore at the time wasn't as large as Novartis, but they were still, they were publicly traded, which, Novartis was too, but they're Swiss, right? So when it come into Millipore at the time was a U.S. company. So that was kind of cool. I mean, we were on the stock market, and got all, you could get on stock options and all this other stuff. And you could kind of follow it. Of course, then we got purchased by Merck, KGaA, Darmstadt. And then, we weren't a U.S. company anymore, but that's neither here nor there. But shortly thereafter, like I said, about a year and a half, when I was doing the field application scientist, I remember I was doing a Luminex assay or a training, and I think it was at City of Hope. And the district manager, Sean Carnes at the time, called me. He said, hey, our one of our San Diego reps, Laura is actually leaving. She's going to take a different job somewhere. Would you be interested in the sales position? My first thought is, no, I don't want that. I'm like, I don't want to be, and I've actually had this conversation with people I've heard. I don't want to be tied to a number. Basically, I don't want to be responsible, right? I want to come out here and say, hey, buy this stuff, but if you don't, doesn't affect me. I don't care.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I basically said no. And I remember I was having a beer with my good buddy Ron, who's actually works for Millipore too, and then he's actually my one of my business associates for the line, and good friends ever since. We were having a beer one Friday afternoon, and he's like, you should really do it. I'm like, well, I don't know. And I was going through, back and forth. And it was after talking with him that he convinced me that, all right, I should try it, and once again, it's these people, and it's the leaps of faith that you take. And I'm like, all right, I'll do it, and I wasn't dead set against it. I was just like, it was just a new thing, right? That's not why I had it was still soon, right? I'd only been a field application scientist for a year now. But I did it. And, I was the rep for Millipore, EMD MilliporeSigma at UCSD for almost 10 years. And it was rep of the year for the entire country one year back in 2012. I always did really well. And I just fell into exactly what I think I was meant to do. And, it took all that pathway, but, that's where I got. And it was all about, the relationships, which I talk to our sales reps about all the time. It's the relationships with the customers, which is really indicative if you can follow the pathway that we've been talking about all afternoon here. It's who you know, how you interact with these people, and how they, interact with you is like, are you personal? There's somebody that you want to talk to, right? And so over the 10 years, I built a really, really good, personal branding, if you will, that people recognized me as. I wasn't the guy just pushing the products. I was there if they needed me. Everybody knew that I worked for Millipore and MilliporeSigma. I was fun. One of my things I'm most famous for, and Kelly, who's my rep down here, still does it, is I had my own Pokemon business cards.
Sweet.
And so I was playing Pokemon with my son one day. I'm like, hey, this would be a good idea to make business cards. So I did. And, and I made different Pokemon business cards, and people would collect them, and, they'd come up to the show. So, it's like, you just do these types of things. So I was known as that, and as the Star Wars guy and everything else. And it really, really resonated with the customers. It takes time. You don't become everybody's friend in the year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. But after 10 years, I remember one, I can't remember his name, but he's working over at the Stanford Consortium for Regenerative Medicine. One of our reps came in and was talking to him, and she was telling him that she was working with me, and that I had just picked up that building or whatever. And I remember the guy saying to this day, oh, wow, Michael, he's an institution down here. And I'm like, okay, that sounds great and I'm happy, but it wasn't what I was gearing towards. But the concept that somebody thought of me in that manner based on what I had developed and who I knew really just resonated with me. I'm like, wow, I didn't realize I had that much, I don't know, influence is the right word, but or just, visibility, that people see me as, like I'm kind of like ingrained in the San Diego, biotech ecosystem, and that's kind of cool. But the nice thing is I wasn't seen as like, salesman. I was seen as, guy in sales, but hey, he's a pretty cool guy to know because he knows this person or he can get that or whatever. So that was really cool. And those 10 years I really enjoyed, and really kind of, I fell really into my niche and found what I really wanted to do, and did pretty well at it so far. So
that's freaking awesome. And like, I think it kind of like, again, it's kind of like once you just have to, it's kind of like this function where you just have to explore. You're kind of like in a jungle, like with a machete, like,
yeah, exactly.
You're just cutting through. And then finally you're like, oh, and it's
right.
wide
And then the
open.
oasis shows up and you're like, cool.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast with Michael Paliotti. In part 3, we'll explore his transition from field application scientist to full-time sales, what ultimately convinced him to make the switch, how he developed his own approach to selling, and why relationships are at the heart of everything he does. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. See you next time. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.